Welcome to the Israel-Palestine Report. I am your host, Professor Alon Burstein. I am a professor of political science and Israel Institute Fellow at Tufts University. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining. If this is your first time joining, what we do here is we review what has happened in the latest week in the Israeli-Palestine arena. Usually we focus on what's happening in the Gaza Strip. We also look at the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, sometimes Yemen, Iran, Iraq, basically every arena, everywhere where things related to this arena might be developing. It's nice to see some of the people that I already recognize some of the names. If you are new, feel free, hit that subscribe button. You can see all of the updates that I upload and interviews and everything else that has to do with news related to, again, this arena. What we are going to be discussing in the next hour or so. First, I'm going to look at where things stand in the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Where are things with regards to the first phase of the ceasefire? What is happening with regards to return of the bodies of hostages, as well as the other facets like the opening of the Rafah crossing and the truce and ceasefire between the sides. Related to that, we're going to look at the repeated rounds of violence that have happened between Israel and Hamas still over the last week. The result is several dozen Palestinians that are killed each week in these different clashes. This week we also had an event where Hamas operatives ambushed and injured IDF soldiers. We're going to look at where things stand in the truce, how fragile it really is. I'm also going to talk a little bit at the end at the situation between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon and what is happening in that arena that is really becoming a powder keg that is threatening to explode almost every day. And then we're going to also talk about, I'm actually going to start from this, the killing of Yasser abu-Shabab. Yasser abu-Shabab, I'm going to talk about somewhat at length, was the leader of the militia, the popular forces in the Gaza Strip. This is the largest Israel-backed militia. Israel had seemingly a lot of high hopes and plans for what abu-Shabab was going to do in the future of the Gaza Strip. The United States was also looking to abu-Shabab, possibly take over some security roles. He was killed in the last week. We're going to look at what happened there. With that, I'm now going to take a minute or two of pause to let people join in. Feel free, if you're joining in, to write where you're coming from. And if you have any specific questions, you can always feel free, write them in the chat. I do recommend a question or cue or something before so that I can just identify them while I'm speaking. One last thing I'll say before I'll take a break and look at some of the comments that are already coming in is I'm now going to put into the chat a link to the newsletter of the Israel-Palestine Report. So far, I've sent out exactly one email that was to let people know about this live event. So I do not send out a lot of emails with that. But if you're interested to know about live events or classes, or sometimes I'll send out if there's a news blast of something going on, you can feel free. I just put that in the chat now. So with that, it's nice to see some of the people coming in. And again, feel free to let me know where you're coming from and if you have any specific questions or anything that you would like me to relate to before we get started. Taking a pause of a moment just to let people sign in and settle in. Thank you to several people who are saying they're subscribers and loyal watchers. By the way, if you are coming in from anywhere in the northeast of the United States, then I sympathize with you on the cold weather that has really come upon us. Winter is finally here in the last week. So, with that, as promised, I'm going to start with the killing of Yasser abu-Shabab. This is something that has largely, I would argue, been glossed over by a lot of the media, but is possibly one of the bigger developments that have happened since the ceasefire began with regards to the possibilities for what's going to happen in the next phases and basically a pivoting of those possibilities. Yasser abu-Shabab was killed on Thursday in Rafah. There are reports that his body was brought to a hospital in Israel. They tried to revive him but failed. I will say those reports are pretty substantiated. However, the hospital spokespeople themselves issued a statement saying abu-Shabab was never brought to the hospital, nor did he die in the hospital. So there is that denial, but most of the official reports are saying that, in fact, that is where he died. Who was Yasser abu-Shabab, and why am I saying that this is such a big deal? He was the leader of a militia in the southern parts of the Gaza Strip, the militia Al-Qawat al-Shabia, which is Arabic for the Popular Forces, which controlled several different areas in the southern parts of the Gaza Strip, primarily in Rafah, in these areas over here, and in the eastern areas of Han Yunis, in these areas over here. One of the important facets is that those are areas that were controlled by the Israeli military. In other words, this was a Palestinian armed militia, a Palestinian armed faction that was operating under, to some extent, the protection and the auspices of the Israeli military in the areas that were controlled by the IDF already since March of 2025. The militia gained prominence in May of 2025 and was also the only one. There are several militias in the Gaza Strip that are somewhat backed by Israel. Abu-Shabab, the Popular Forces, was the only one that openly said that they are in fact working with Israel. They denied receiving arms and money from Israel, but it was pretty substantiated that Israel was both funding the organization and was giving it arms. There were all kinds of different proofs that were published about this. And within this, its role was to some extent operate as instilling law and order in the areas in the southern parts of the Gaza Strip. Again, the areas Israel controls, but Israel does not want to be operating as a police force in that area. So for the Palestinians that were living in the areas of Rafah and Khan Yunis, the Popular Forces, to some extent, became the local governors, the local police. Lots of different reports about how many people were involved in the Popular Forces militia. Initial reports said about 300. Other estimates said about 1,000. What is important is that how we understand their role in the southern parts of the Gaza Strip obviously depends who you ask. As far as Israel was concerned, these were the good guys of the Palestinians that Israel trusted. It was arming them, and they were to some extent instilling law and order. They promised to fight Hamas. They did engage Hamas militarily, and they were to some extent making sure that the areas under the control of Israel were to large extents not total anarchy, but somewhat operating within some sort of administration, on the one hand. On the other hand, over the months, there were increasing reports that the militia under Abu-Shabab was operating as a warlord, was instilling lots of terrorism against the local population, lots and lots of accusations from international actors that the Abu-Shabab militia was confiscating and stealing aid and then reselling it to the population. So it was to some extent organizing the aid in the southern parts of the Gaza Strip, but was in effect running a black market. Those reports also were somewhat strengthened by the fact that Yasser abu-Shabab himself, the leader of that militia, who by the way was 32 years old when he died, was in fact in the past a drug trafficker. He had been jailed by Hamas for drug trafficking in the Gaza Strip, and he escaped from the Hamas prison after that prison was bombed by Israel at the beginning of the war. So the role of Abu-Shabab himself and his militia in the southern parts of the Gaza Strip, again, it depends how we look at it. On the one hand, this was becoming somewhat of an alternative local government in the Gaza Strip. It engaged Hamas militarily. Hamas was very scared of people joining the Popular Forces. They issued death sentences against Abu-Shabab. They tried to attack him. They tried to ambush him and assassinate him at least 3 times. All these things were happening because they were fearful, because he was becoming a rival for the Hamas-led administration in the Gaza Strip on the one hand. On the other hand, he was also operating as a dictatorship, oppressing the population, stealing a lot of the aid, and to some extent, there was a lot of accusations that this is going to turn into, much like situations we saw in the past, the United States and Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Israel, Lebanon, these ideas that you can just give a local militia the responsibility and then there'll be peace. It's just going to cascade into another warlord-style situation. So with all this, why am I saying this is such a big deal? The fact that he was now killed. Because while he was operating this militia in southern Gaza, Israel and the United States, according to recent reports, were coming to rely on that militia more and more when they were developing their future plans for the Gaza Strip. One of the problems, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later when I talk about phase 2 of the deal, one of the problems the United States is having is that absolutely no one in the world wants to fight Hamas, except for Israel, and the United States does not want Israel to fight Hamas. So right now, there's no one who's willing to engage Hamas militarily, whereas here, there was an armed unit within the Gaza Strip that was willing to do so. So over time, Israel, and there were leaks over the last week that the United States also was coming to incorporate the popular forces into their future plans of who's going to be in charge of security in the Gaza Strip and who's going to be responsible for fighting Hamas. Now, how was abu-Shabab killed? That also is quite controversial. Initially, there were a lot of reports that he was assassinated by Hamas itself. This was then categorically denied by Israel and the militia. Both of them said that abu-Shabab was killed in Rafah as part of a local dispute. Israeli reports said that he was actually killed by his own guards as part of a territorial dispute over how much they're cooperating with Israel and disputes about how to run the militia. Within the militia itself, they said that he was killed while trying to resolve a dispute between families and a stray bullet killed him. With that, I'll say that both Israel and the militia have a vested interest in saying that Hamas did not kill him. They want to show that Hamas does not have that power. So at this point, I will say it's likely that he was not killed by Hamas. This was more of a coincidence. But Hamas is extremely happy that he is dead. They had celebrations throughout Gaza and actually in refugee camps in Lebanon, handing out sweets. They had condemned him to death, and now they saw this as another step in establishing their control in the Gaza Strip. And very likely, this is going to be something that helps strengthen Hamas. The popular forces are not disappearing. They've already named a new leader, Rassan al-Tahini, who was the deputy of abu-Shabab. He has vowed that his group will continue to fight the terrorists in the Gaza Strip. I will say that it is most likely at this point that militia is likely going to start to disintegrate. And what we're going to see is something that I and many other people warned about, which is once that militia starts to disintegrate, what we're going to have is now several hundred to several thousand Palestinians that have been armed and funded by Israel in the areas that are controlled by Israel that all of a sudden are not going to be operating as a unified militia fighting Hamas. Instead, it's going to turn into total anarchy with a lot of these militias armed. And that's why I'm saying, beyond the fact that the United States and Israel seemingly had a lot of plans for this militia in the future, and again, I'll talk about them in a minute, it is likely that his death, unless this new leader manages to unite everyone really fast, his death is going to end up having vast repercussions for the security situation for Palestinians and also for the Israeli military in the areas of Rafah and Khan Yunis, because, once again, hundreds of Palestinians within this militia that have been armed and funded by Israel now have lost their leader, and there's no telling really where they're going to turn those guns, if it's going to be still towards fighting Hamas, towards fighting each other, or possibly towards fighting the Israeli military. So again, that happened on Thursday. I'm going to talk a little bit when I talk about phase 2, how that is also a monkey wrench in the plans the United States was possibly developing. But I'm pausing here to see if there are any questions, if people want me to repeat anything, because I know that's a lot of information. Like I said, I think a lot of the media is actually glossing over this. Most people that I spoke to hadn't even heard about this or barely knew who he was. And I would argue to my followers, this is actually one of the bigger developments as far as stability is going in the southern parts of the Gaza Strip. So I'm pausing here. Feel free if there's any questions, you want me to repeat anything before I continue on to the next thing that I had planned to talk about. Greetings from Tasmania. Wow, there's a place I'd love to visit. What's the weather like there? Not today, D7P. Sorry, I'm not sure what your name is, but please tell me, what's the weather like in Tasmania at this point? Anyone else? Any other questions? Anything you'd like to comment on? Like me to repeat? Giving it another 25 seconds. You can't see it, but I actually have a clock behind the computer here. So the question was asked, what's going on with the Druze? I'm going to talk towards the end of the report about Lebanon. That does not relate to the Druze specifically, but it does relate to some extent with regards to Syria and the northern parts of Israel. So I'll try to talk a little bit more about the Druze then. If I do not answer your question, Artemis 7798, please feel free to repeat it. Also going to say again, for those who joined, I'm again putting a link right now in the chat to join the newsletter that I have started. This is a newsletter of the Israel-Palestine Report. I've so far sent out exactly one email announcing to people about this live. So again, it's not something that's going to be repeated again and again. I don't blast a lot of emails. If you'd like to sign up, feel free. The link is there in the chat. Okay, so with that, and again, we're going to get back to the killing of abu-Shabab and the possible role or diminishing role of the local militias now when we talk about phase 2 of the deal. But before that, I'm going to start with talking about phase 1. Where do things stand essentially within the ceasefire agreement between the sides? So I always start from this reminder, and I'm sorry to those for whom it seems tedious, but it's actually important to remember what are the two phases of the deal. What is phase 1 supposed to include? What is phase 2 supposed to include? Phase 1 that we are in now, coming on 2 months. Phase 1 of the deal included a truce between the sides, so end of the fighting, and the Israeli military redeploying in the Gaza Strip, which it did to the famous yellow line. That is a place that the Israeli military has withdrawn and Hamas has taken over the other areas. It also involved the release of all live hostages and return of the bodies of all hostages in exchange for the release of Palestinian prisoners and return of the bodies of Palestinians who were held by Israel, the massive entrance of humanitarian aid, and the opening of the Rafah crossing. Of all of these, what did happen? The Israeli military did redeploy, and Israel now controls, give or take, 53% to 58% of the Gaza Strip. Honestly, it depends who you believe. Different, somewhat reliable sources say 53 and 58%, so it depends exactly who you believe, and also how exactly we look at zones of control or not. The zones that Israel controls are largely the zones that are closer to the Israeli border. So everything north of this line over here and east of this line over here are the areas that are controlled by Israel. And this strip over here is the area that is controlled right now by Hamas. Within the areas that are controlled by Hamas, the majority of Palestinians right now live, give or take 1.8, 1.9 million Palestinians are now condensed into that area. So the redeployment did happen. The truce between the sides, again, I'm going to talk a little bit later about the ongoing violence, but if you've been following my reports, you know that to some extent, the fighting between the sides has ended. To another extent, every day, there are airstrikes and bombings that happen when Palestinians attempt to cross the yellow line. Israel always says that it was armed operatives. Palestinian sources always say it was civilians. There's also been cases of Hamas armed operatives carrying out deadly and violent attacks against the Israeli military. Each one of these, though, is relatively sporadic. So to some extent, the truce is being upheld, but however, it is also constantly violated. Humanitarian aid, to large extents, that part of the truce, that part of phase 1 has also been lived up to. Israel allowed large amounts of the humanitarian aid to come in. Israel tried to block the entrance of humanitarian aid at different times when Hamas did not return all the bodies of hostages. Their attempts were blocked by the United States, and the United States has now taken over distribution of aid in the Gaza Strip, but even more aid is coming in than was promised. In regards to hostages, all the live hostages were in fact released, and Israel released the Palestinian prisoners who were supposed to release in exchange. And with regards to the bodies of hostages, Hamas returned a certain amount of bodies at the initial stages of the deal, and since then has been excavating the different parts of the Gaza Strip, and every now and then has been locating another body and returning it. Israel is accusing Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad of prolonging this on purpose. They are repeatedly saying that Hamas knows the location of the bodies, and in fact, they are deliberately taking their sweet time, so to speak. Hamas is saying the bodies are buried under mass amounts of rubble. Sometimes they're buried in tunnels, and they simply cannot get to those bodies. Be that as it may, whatever the truth is, the fact is that over the last weeks, Hamas has been steadily returning 1 or 2 bodies of hostages every week. This last week, they returned 1 more body of hostage, up until the point that right now there's only 1 hostage, the body of one hostage that remains in the Gaza Strip. Out of the total of 255 hostages, living and dead, that had been held in the Gaza Strip, there's now one that is left, Ran Goeli. He was an Israeli police officer who was killed on October 7th in the October 7th attack, and his body was kidnapped back to the Gaza Strip. Hamas is, again, theoretically still looking for that body, and if and when it is returned, they will have fulfilled that obligation. It was supposed to happen immediately when the ceasefire started. It has taken until now. So again, different sides are saying they lived up to it or they have violated it by it taking so long. The last part of phase 1 relates to the Rafah crossing. The Rafah crossing was supposed to be opened immediately when the deal started. Israel refused. It refused to open the Rafah crossing because Hamas had not returned all the bodies of hostages. Israel said that's a violation of the deal. If Hamas is doing that, Israel is not going to open the Rafah crossing. Over the last weeks, Israel came under monumental pressure from the United States to open the Rafah crossing. And this week, on Wednesday, suddenly, Israel announced that it is going to open the crossing. And again, what is that crossing? It's the crossing over here that is the axis between Gaza and Egypt. It is controlled on the Gazan side at this point by Israeli forces. After Israel made this announcement, the United States, the Civil Military Coordination Center, that is the CMCC, the United States base that is established in southern Israel, also confirmed that the crossing is going to be opened. And they said that it is going to be staffed by members of the EU and by Palestinians from the West Bank. Why I say that with a little bit of a smile is because that is a way of bypassing one of Israel's terms. Israel said that it will not allow the Palestinian Authority to set foot in the Gaza Strip and operate the Rafah crossing. The United States has said they do want the Palestinian Authority. So what ended up happening is the United States announced that Palestinians from the West Bank will operate the Rafah crossing, but they will not wear tags of the Palestinian Authority. So you will not be able to take pictures of the Palestinian Authority actually operating the crossing. Seemingly, this is a political deal that's meant to not embarrass Israel with the fact that the United States has imposed on Israel that the Palestinian Authority will, in fact, be operating that crossing along with the EU. However, later on that same day, on Wednesday, Israel changed its announcement and said that the crossing will be open, but it is only going to be open one way. It is only going to be open for the exit of Palestinians from Gaza through to Egypt, not for the entrance of Palestinians from Egypt back into Gaza. That is something that enraged Egypt and many of the other surrounding Arab countries. Condemnation came out from Qatar, Jordan condemnation, Qatar, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Jordan, all of the countries that are involved. The condemnation, according to at least what the country said, was that this is seemingly part of Israel's plan to expel Palestinians. You can leave the Gaza Strip, but you cannot come back. I will say that more likely Egypt is concerned about the fact that the more Palestinians end up being stuck on the Egyptian side, the more this is going to become Egypt's problem. The fact that there's going to be hundreds, if not thousands, of Palestinians that end up in the Sinai Peninsula, where Egypt has already a big security problem and very little control, having an addition of thousands of refugees without the ability of repatriating them to anywhere is something that Egypt is fearful of, regardless of any commitment that it might have to stopping the exile of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. So be that as it may, again, whatever the truth is, right now Israel has announced that's going to happen. It hasn't done it yet. But Egypt has said they're not going to allow that from their side. If Israel only opens the crossing one direction, Egypt is not going to allow the crossing to be open. Likely we will see some sort of compromise coming up in the coming days, but that is where things stand with regards to phase 1. Pausing here before diving into, and now what's happening with phase 2. Once again, just checking if there are any questions. Thank you for the compliments that this is unbiased information. I try my best. Often I'm told that I bounce between the sides so much that it can be confusing, but I'm glad if the end result is that the information is unbiased, then it's definitely worth it. So that is all phase 1. What is going to happen next? Phase 1, one of the aspects of Trump's plan is that it's not bound by time. No one said when we have to move on. But right now, the situation is extremely volatile, and the sides are getting restless. And mostly, who's getting restless is the US president. Trump is known for a lot of things, whether you love him or hate him, he's known for a lot of things. And among others, he's not known for being patient with a situation that is volatile. He wants things resolved quickly. The fact that this has now gone on for 2 months is starting to bug the US administration. Over the last several weeks, there have been a lot of reports that the United States is getting ready to announce that it's moving on to phase 2, regardless of the return of all the bodies of hostages, regardless of the return of regardless of completing phase 1, even though Israel said no, that's a condition. Trump announced on Wednesday, as Becca just said in the comments, that the intention is to move to phase 2 very soon. I didn't see, Becca, you're saying in your comment that he said in like a week. I didn't see that. I saw that it said very soon. Possibly there were 2 different statements, or I may have missed that. What does phase 2 then include? What does phase 2 actually mean? Phase 2 is essentially everything else in Trump's 20-point plan. Phase 1 was these initial things. Phase 2, unlike the previous deals that were divided into 3, sometimes 4 phases, phase 2 is everything else. That includes Hamas disarming, the demilitarization of the Gaza Strip, which is something often that's glossed over. People say Hamas disarms. Demilitarization is a much bigger thing. It involves rounding up all of the missiles and rockets. It involves destroying all of the tunnels. It involves collecting all the weapons. It involves decommissioning the actual fighters and finding them other employment, otherwise they return to fighting. It's a much bigger thing. So disarming, demilitarizing the Gaza Strip, the complete withdrawal of the Israeli military from the Gaza Strip, the establishment of 2 bodies in the Gaza Strip, the Board of Peace, that is supposed to be an international overarching governing body, and the International Stabilization Force, the ISF, that's supposed to be made up of lots of different militaries that are going to assume security for the Gaza Strip. Developing a new technocratic government of Palestinians that is supposed to be the ones that actually are in charge of governing the Gaza Strip, as well as the rebuilding of different areas of Gaza and Hamas giving up its power, because essentially all of these other elements are now governing the Gaza Strip. So where do things stand with regards to this? On the one hand, in the last couple of weeks, there have been advances have been made. The United States passed the UN Security Council Resolution 2803 and essentially got United Nations approval for the establishment of the Board of Peace that is going to be headed by Trump and is supposed to include lots of other countries. It's not been published yet which country is going to include, but a lot of rumors about the different negotiating countries. It also approved the establishment of the International Stabilization Force, the ISF. The International Stabilization Force, again, is supposed to be made up of the different militaries, not the United States and not Israel, that is going to assume security for the Gaza Strip. So on the one hand, the United Nations now gave its blessing. The World Bank also said it's happy to help fund this. On the other hand, 2 problems immediately arose. One, Hamas said, that's all well and good. We're not going to disarm. And the United Nations resolution does not give the ISF, that new theoretical military, authorization to actually use force. It says that Hamas will disarm and will give up its governing powers in the Gaza Strip as the ISF takes over. It doesn't say that this will be done by force. So if Hamas is refusing, we got a problem. As far as the implementation of that, that's totally stuck. Somewhat as a direct relation to that, after the Hamas announced that they are refusing to disarm, no one was willing to join the ISF. The United States expected that countries, everyone from Qatar to Turkey to Pakistan to Indonesia, possibly Jordan, Egypt, everyone is going to want to send troops to help stabilize the Gaza Strip. But if Hamas is refusing to disarm, then the ISF is going to be caught between the Israeli military on the one hand and armed Hamas on the other. Very likely there's going to be outbreaks of violence, and they do not want to be in that situation. The result is that not only did no country sign on to be part of the ISF, the only country that had agreed until now to send troops to the ISF, which was Azerbaijan, pulled out after Hamas announced that and the UN Security Council approved the resolution. Azerbaijan pulled out and said, we change our mind. We are not sending troops to this undefined amorphous mission in the Gaza Strip. So at the present stage, in terms as far as moving things along, the mission has been approved, but it is not actually implementable on the ground. As a result of this, and because, once again, Trump wants to see this moving forward, over the last several weeks, the United States is seemingly turning to two different routes. Not the implementation of phase 2 the way it was envisioned in the 20-point plan, but rather developing new plans. And again, I said seemingly because the United States has not announced that it is abandoning the 20-point plan. I am saying if we look at what it's doing, it is to some extent abandoning it. The biggest change is something that I reported about initially already last week, which is the new Gaza plan. This is something that has been developed by the CMCC, again, the Civil Military Coordination Center of the United States in southern Israel. This plan essentially divides Gaza in two. It declares the areas that are controlled by the Israeli military. So again, all of these areas that are closer to the border with Israel, it declares them as the green zone. And the area that is controlled by Hamas, it declares as the red zone. So the Gaza Strip is now going to be divided in two. Within that, the plan is then to start the rebuilding and reconstruction efforts only in the green zone, only in the areas that are controlled by Israel. And the plan, at least again what was published so far, is to build temporary communities, not to rebuild the entire Gaza Strip, to build temporary communities within those areas that will be temporary housing, but communities with schools, sewage, electricity, medical facilities, humanitarian aid, all these things that people need in order to have at least the semblance of a normal life. And then the United States wants to plan this, according to the report, is going to start in eastern Rafah over here, and then to build 10 of these communities, each one's supposed to be able to house 20 to 25,000 Palestinians, and to invite Palestinians from the areas that are controlled by Hamas to start coming to those areas, the areas that are clear of Hamas and that are now completely refurbished and rebuilt. The aim, according to what was published in the New York Times and in the Wall Street Journal, is to draw Palestinians away from the Hamas-controlled areas and to gradually shrink Hamas's influence over the population. The quote that I pulled out from one of the articles is that the hope is that, quote, in the end, the Hamas government and the Al-Qassam and Palestinian Islamic Jihad operatives will stay in the red enclave with no humanitarian assistance and surrounded by the Israeli military. So that's the aim here. Why did I say that this is a massive change from the plans of phase 2? First of all, what the United States is doing with this plan is de facto accepting that Hamas is here to stay. While phase 2 is supposed to include, remember the first things I said, was the disarming of Hamas and the demilitarization of the Gaza Strip and the Hamas government disbanding. Instead, now the United States is saying, okay, no one is going to actually force Hamas to do this. Instead, let's try to plan around that, accept that they are still controlling some, again, depends who you listen to, but 40 to 50% of the Gaza Strip, and encourage Palestinians to leave those areas, so that Hamas loses its grip over them. That's a big change from the idea that the only way that Gaza will be rebuilt is by actually disarming and demilitarizing the Strip. This accepts that Hamas is here to stay and is saying, how can we work around that? The hope is that eventually it'll simply run out of steam if people are willing to leave. With that, even if this plan were to be implemented, there are scores of questions that still remain unanswered. Among others, some of the glaring issues within this plan are, number one, this would take months, if not years, to construct. The places in the Gaza Strip that the United States is planning this have been reduced to rubble. It would take months just to clear the rubble and the unexploded munitions. Underneath the rubble are tunnels and likely bodies of Palestinians. All this is going to take time. After that, you have to actually build the infrastructure and reestablish these communities. even if that were to happen, if these communities are each going to house 20 to 25,000 people, if you manage to build 10 of them, and again, think how long that would take, you build 10 of them, you've built communities for give or take only 1.15% of the population of Gaza. This is not something that's going to end up changing the situation for Hamas on the ground. It's also important to note that while the United States is saying that these facilities are going to draw Palestinians out, it's very unclear, number one, if Palestinians are going to want to leave the areas that they live in now and go to areas that are possibly still under the control of the Israeli military. Or there was another report that maybe the ISF will come in, but again, the ISF right now doesn't exist. So it's unclear who exactly will provide security there. This is where I wanted to point out that the initial report said that possibly the popular forces of abu-Shabab would be the ones that would control the security of these areas. But right now, I would argue that that has taken a massive blow with the death of the leader of that militia. And it is unclear if Palestinians would want to come to these communities or if Hamas would also let them. Something else also that this plan is ignoring is that while these communities would be established, possibly in the coming months, Hamas is already doing this in the areas that are controlled by the organization. Al-Arabi al-Jadid published this past week on Monday that Hamas has now completed restaffing all of the posts within its government in the Gaza Strip. It has reappointed all the officers to the Al-Qassam brigades. And there are also reports that the school systems in the Gaza Strip are starting to operate again. Hamas very, very celebratorily opened the Islamic University in Gaza again. So the idea that Palestinians will be enticed to leave these areas because they will have a semblance of a normal life is ignoring the fact that meanwhile Hamas is doing this much faster and much more effectively in the areas under its control. So it's unclear. Would Israel also agree to this? Is it going to be the one that is in charge of stopping Hamas from coming into these communities? All these questions remain very, very unanswered. What is important, though, to take away is that the fact that the United States is now considering this plan is to some extent an admission of the fact that phase 2 is not happening. Phase 2, the way it was supposed to happen, the way it was envisioned by the UN Security Council in its mission statement and by Trump's 20-point plan, is not going to happen anytime soon. So as a result, the United States is trying to look for different options. The second thing the United States is seemingly trying to do, and this is the last thing I'll say about the ceasefire, then I'll pause for questions, is they're also trying to advance on the other routes everything that is not about demilitarizing or disarming Hamas. So I said that they're thinking of rebuilding the areas in the Gaza Strip that are controlled by Israel. Another report from this past week happened on Wednesday. It was reported in several outlets in Israel and then quoted in Reuters and elsewhere. This was a leak from the, again, CMCC, the Civil Military Coordination Center, that said that the United States has informed international diplomats that the Trump administration plans by the 15th of this month, by the 15th of December, to announce who is going to be part of the Board of Peace. So again, the United States seemingly cannot establish the ISF, the National Stabilization Force, but wants to at least establish the political side of the Board of Peace. And is also going to announce who are going to be the 15 technocrats that are supposed to now become the governing committee of the Gaza Strip. Again, within Trump's 20-point plan, there will be a governing committee of Palestinians that is going to assume control, to be the active government in the Gaza Strip. The United States is going to announce who they are going to be. One thing I will say is that there were negotiations between the different Palestinian factions almost a month ago in Cairo that were about choosing the identity of the technocratic government. And there were pretty established reports that said that Hamas had personally selected at least half of that committee of 15. Now, we don't know their identity. We don't know if those are the 15 that the United States is going to announce. It's also very clear that establishing this technocratic government is going to mean nothing because Hamas government in the red zone, so to speak, is still up and running. It's not going to accept this government. So this is largely rhetoric and statements. But again, what we are seeing is that the United States is trying, on the one hand, to push forward in any way it can. But all of those ways accept the fact that Hamas is armed on the ground, there to stay. No one wants to engage with Hamas except for Israel. The United States does not want Israel to re-engage with Hamas, so it's looking to establishing temporary communities, possibly hoping to draw Palestinians out of the red zones, establishing the board of peace, establishing a technocratic government that will have no responsibility on the ground. All this just in order to show some semblance of moving forward while things are stuck. With that, I'm going to pause. I've seen a few questions coming up. I'm now scrolling back. Seeing a question. I'm curious to hear what Alon's thoughts are on senior Hamas official Khalid Mashal saying today, no disarming, no international security forces. So this comes from the Baba News. Like I said, that is something that Hamas has been repeatedly saying again and again. They have constantly said they are refusing to disarm, and they never, by the way, said that they were going to disarm. If we look back at the acceptance of Trump's peace plan, Hamas never signed it. Neither did Israel. The peace plan was signed and accepted by the United States, Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey. They met in Egypt and Sharm el-Sheikh. They all declared the end of the war. And at that time, I was saying that's all well and good. The fighting sides have not accepted these terms. Now, Israel at this point is entirely dependent on the United States for everything, specifically also the identity of the state leaders. Netanyahu is entirely beholden to Trump on everything. So Trump can essentially compel Israel to go along with the plan. Hamas, in turn, is a lot less beholden to a lot of these other actors. So it has been enticed until now to go along with this. But when it came time to disarm, like you say, they have simply said, no, we are not going to do that. I'm looking at some of the other questions here. Sounds like they are shrinking Gaza, says Becca. Yes, they're actually cutting Gaza in two. Some of them called it the Little Gaza plan, to create a Little Gaza and a Big Gaza. Again, how that actually plays out at this point, very unclear. Question, have there been any clearly articulated ultimatums or threats if the Great Plan falls through? So, Crab Lewis asks, has anyone said what happens if the plan falls through? There have been lots and lots of vague threats. The United States has said that if the plan falls through, then Hamas will be disarmed by force and all hell will rain down. The term all hell raining down on Gaza has been reused by the United States and Israel time and again. Israel has said Hamas will be disarmed. Either they will do it peacefully or they'll be disarmed by Israel. Again, though, Israel, up until now, since the ceasefire began, twice has asked permission from the United States to declare the ceasefire null and void because of escalations of Hamas operatives, and the United States has said no. So, yes, there have been threats made as to what happens if this fails. Once again, though, if we look at the identity of the actors, and specifically the Trump administration, how it operates, the Trump administration never wants to admit that something has failed. Again, that's part of the MO and the rhetoric. This has now come the political scientist in me that's looking at the way Trump operates. So even if things don't work, the administration tries to spin that around to say that was actually part of the plan. That was how it was going to be. We saw this repeatedly with the attacks in Iran and the fact that the uranium in the underground facilities in Fordow were not destroyed. Immediately, the Trump administration came out and said they were destroyed. That's all a lie. And then the rhetoric changed a little bit to we never wanted to destroy them. Whatever it was, it is never defined as a failure. Because of that, it's seemingly at this point, even though Hamas is saying not going to happen, you'll have to, again, we'll go down with the ship of Gaza. The Trump administration is still saying everything's going exactly according to plan. So yes, a lot of threats have been made. Will they actually come to fruition or be lived out? Cannot say at this point. Question, would Hamas disarm to the technocrats? So Becca asks, would Hamas agree to disarm to the technocrats? Very unlikely. Hamas has said that they are willing to give up their governing powers, not disarm, give up their governing powers for a Palestinian administration. So seemingly for the Palestinian Authority or for a Palestinian future state. Could they recognize a technocratic government as a Palestinian entity? They could, But they've also said that they're not going to accept a Palestinian puppet regime that is put in place by the Board of Peace. So they're unlikely to do so. But I will say, Hamas may give up its governing powers. In fact, many analysts have said that Hamas would like to give up its governing powers. Gaza right now is impossible to govern. Right now, it is nearly 100% of the people are internally displaced. There's poverty is not even the word. The entire economic system has completely collapsed. 70 to 90% of all the buildings are damaged or completely destroyed. 3% of the population has been killed. Everyone is traumatized from the war. The school system is collapsed. All the infrastructures are collapsed. To some extent, to be blunt, it sucks to be the government in Gaza right now. Hamas would probably, to some extent, like to hand over that problem to someone else. However, they have repeatedly said, all that's well and good, but they're not going to hand over their weaponry. They're not going to disarm. So to some extent, they might be willing to hand over some governing powers to the technocratic government. I would be very surprised if they would in fact be willing to disarm to that government. I'm looking through some other questions here. Okay. A lot of interesting commentary, but I'm not seeing any questions. Feel free, someone tell me if I missed something. Otherwise, I am going on to the next two things that I wanted to discuss with regards to what has happened in the last week. First, like I said, with all this, while everyone's waiting for this amorphous phase 2 that might happen, on the ground in Gaza, every day we are repeatedly seeing these continuous escalations between the sides. Almost every day, there is a case of an Israeli airstrike or live fire of soldiers or tanks against Palestinians that are crossing over the yellow line into the Israeli-controlled areas. In almost each and every one of these cases, the Israeli military immediately issues a statement saying that the Palestinians had crossed over the yellow line and were behaving suspiciously, approached IDF soldiers, and were endangering them, and that's why they were attacked. In almost every one of those incidents, Palestinian sources in turn report that the Palestinians were civilians and either had made a mistake crossing the yellow line, or were trying to go back to their home, or were searching for food, or were searching for bodies, or things like that. In the overwhelming majority of cases, I'll be completely honest, we don't know. We don't know what actually happened. There are some cases that are more glaring. There have been several instances of armed Palestinian operatives that have come to the yellow line, approached, and opened fire at the Israeli military, and then were attacked. There have also been cases, like that happened last week, where 2 children had been trying to collect firewood in eastern Khan Yunis and were killed by a missile fired from a drone, children aged 10 and 12, and Israel did not deny this. Israel said that they were behaving suspiciously and were carrying out some suspicious activity on the ground, did not deny the actual Palestinian reports of what happened. So there are cases that we have more compelling suggestions and evidence over what may have happened. In most of those cases, again, I fully admit, we don't actually know. We have conflicting reports from both sides that are, at this point, almost a copy-paste each and every time. The Israeli military issues the same thing. Palestinian sources issue the same thing. Just throughout this week, on Monday, there were 2 incidents in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip that involved Israeli airstrikes, 1 incident in the central parts of the Gaza Strip that involved tank fire. On Tuesday, Palestinian sources reported people killed in Al Bureij in this area and in eastern Khan Yunis, all in these similar incidents crossing the yellow line. Today, on Saturday, 3 Palestinians were killed, also in a similar incident. What did happen this week, though, that was different, happened on Wednesday when there was a major ambush that Hamas operatives carried out against Israeli soldiers in the areas of Rafah, in the southern parts over here. In those areas where there are still armed Hamas operatives, some of them are hiding in the tunnel, some have been killed over the last weeks, a few of them have managed to escape to the Hamas-controlled areas, but a lot of them are still held up there. They carried out seemingly an elaborate ambush when 2 operatives emerged from a tunnel. Then they carried out gunfire and fired RPGs at the Israeli military armed vehicles. And meanwhile, a 3rd operative snuck up from behind the armed vehicle and planted an explosive on that armed vehicle. 5 Israeli soldiers were injured, one of them badly, 3 of them with medium injuries, and 2 of the attackers were killed. In response to this, Israel carried out massive attacks throughout the Gaza Strip, which is again the dynamic. Whenever there's one of these larger attacks that involves Israeli casualties, Israel then carries out retaliations throughout the entire Gaza Strip. We saw airstrikes in Sajaiya, in the northeastern parts of the Gaza Strip. There were also reports of artillery fire and massive tank fire in the central parts of Gaza City. Airstrikes that were also reported in these central refugee camps, in the refugee camps in central parts of the Gaza City. The largest airstrike that happened in the areas of Han Yunis, in this area over here, but in the Al-Mawasi region, the refugee zone, where there are a lot of Palestinians that are living in tents. There were 4 missiles that were fired to that area. According to Palestinian sources, 6 people were killed in that attack. 2 of them were children. The Israeli military in turn said that it had been targeting a prominent Hamas operative, trying to assassinate him. No reports were given as to who that may have been or if that was successful or not. And once again, this happened several hours. The United States then told Israel, dial it back, and the incident ended. So with that, you can understand that it's very complicated to say what's happening with the truce. On the one hand, is the truce between Israel and Hamas being maintained? Largely, yes. If we look at the last 2 years, those of you who followed me saw initially my daily reports, then several times a week, I was talking about gun battles, street battles, hundreds of people killed sometimes each day. Largely, the truce between the sides, this is a much lower level of fighting on the one hand. On the other hand, almost every day, airstrikes, bombings, and on occasion, we also have these armed attacks of Hamas operatives. The main takeaway from this is just how volatile the situation is. That was the Israeli retaliation to 5 IDF soldiers being injured. If soldiers had been killed, likely we would have seen a harsher escalation. The week before last, when Israel carried out a harsher escalation in response to an ambush of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hamas declared that the ceasefire is over. And at that point, some analysts were saying, okay, we're going back to fighting. That didn't happen, but the situation is extremely volatile. And what I encourage people to think about, link these 2 things together. Link the complete stalling of phase 2 and these hypothetical plans that are maybe supposed to now take months to implement. Now look at what's happening every day in the Gaza Strip. It is, I would argue, unlikely that the current situation can survive for months. The current situation is extremely volatile. Almost every day, there's an incident that could bring the entire truce between the sides cascading down. So these plans that are supposed to take months to be implemented partially, I argue there isn't that much time with regards to the fragility of the truce between the sides. I am pausing here. I'm seeing a lot of commentary on the chat, which I very much encourage. I'm glad people are speaking to each other, although that means I may miss some of the questions. Joe says that he had 2 questions above, but forgot to preface with question. I'm sorry I missed that. But I will admit that right now, scrolling between all the chat is a little bit hard. If you could copy paste them again, I promise, and this time preface with question, I promise I will try to answer those questions. Other commentary, again, a lot of people are discussing. Question: why has Israel so completely lost the hearts and minds information warfight? So if I understand correctly, Karabuz, the question is, why has Israel not been able to convince the international arena of, to be on its side compared to Palestinians? It's a very loaded question because a lot of people, I'm sure, would argue that it's because Israel's the villain and Palestinians are the victim. Others would argue, well, it's because of anti-Semitism, and even though Israel tries to be the most moral army in the world, then it doesn't matter. It's condemned by the world. So there's a lot of political answers that many people would probably give to that. My answer would probably be a lot more technical, and I would say 3 things. 1, historically, The Palestinian movement, from the days of Yasser Arafat all the way to Hamas, has invested mass amounts of its budget to its international presence. It has media offices everywhere it can in the world. It pays thousands upon thousands of people to publicize the Palestinian side of what is happening and to disseminate pictures and to go on social media and etc. Israel simply does not try. This is, again, I'm not saying if it should or shouldn't, right or wrong. I'm saying factually. If I look at the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Israel does not invest nearly nothing in comparison to the Palestinian side. Israel has a lot more resources. The Israeli ministries that were supposed to be doing this were unstaffed throughout the war, large amounts of the time. So that's one reason that if you look just at narratives being pumped to the world, you're going to find the Palestinian side a lot more than the Israeli side. Another reason is just the way sentiments in the world goes. It really doesn't matter if you are right or wrong, what the history of justice is or not. And again, as my followers know, I'm not going to say what my opinion is. The fact is, if you remember the picture from the first Intifada of the Palestinian child throwing a stone with a tank bearing down on him, no amount of explaining is going to beat that picture. Same thing as the picture in Tiananmen Square. We have no idea, I would argue, who that person was that was standing in front of the row of tanks. For all we know, he was the villain who was going to throw Molotov cocktails at the tanks. It doesn't matter. The picture is the picture. And no one asks who it was or what it was, who's right, who's wrong. And in that war, when it comes to the war of information and selling your narrative in a compelling way, you can't beat that picture. So that's a second thing. A third thing has to do also with international politics and diplomacy. As a result of a lot of different things that are associated with the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there is a vast amount of states in the world, not just the Arab and Muslim states, but many more states that have allied themselves with the Palestinian cause. So also politically, who gets a forum to speak and who does not, very often it is the Palestinian side versus the Israeli side. So again, that answer, I imagine, does not satisfy most people because most people would tend to go to the more political answers. That's my analytical answer. I hope it sufficed. Other questions I am looking at before I will say one last thing. Thank you, everyone, for the different compliments and comments. Okay, Joji recopied your question. Is there a chance the government will dissolve because Bibi keeps doing what Trump wants? What would be the final straw? So, yeah, that's a question that has more to do with the internal Israeli politics. Theoretically, the answer would be yes. The hawkish elements within Netanyahu's government, specifically Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who are right now the only ones that are officially in the government with Netanyahu. It's a minority government, officially. Unofficially, it's backed by ultra-Orthodox parties. They keep on threatening that if Israel does not go back to fighting and destroy Hamas, then they'll leave the government. The fact is that right now, everyone who's in government is very, very scared of elections. These would be the first elections since October 7th. This was the government that was in charge during October 7th. Is also most of the players in the government have been in government for the better part of the last 15 years. They are very scared of the next elections. Right now, the next elections in Israel are scheduled for November of next year. There will be a lot of threats. At this point, it is very possible that the side would rather just stay in government right now rather than go to elections. We'll get other questions. Is there any chance the West will allow Israel to prevent rebuilding in Gaza so long as Hamas is armed? It depends who we would call the West, I would say at this point. The West usually is considered to be some amorphous thing that's led by the United States. The United States is the one that's actually forcing Israel into this plan. Israel has said that it does not want to begin rebuilding in the Gaza Strip till Hamas is disarmed. The United States is saying, but that's likely what we're going to do. So at this point, I would say it's more likely that the West is going to force Israel to do that rather than not to do that. I hope I got the question right. Okay, with that, I just answered the question. Thank you. With that, One last thing I'm going to talk about, I'm not going to get into it in depth. It's just another arena that I would argue is not receiving enough attention and needs to be receiving more attention, and that is what is happening between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. We are now over a year since the ceasefire between the sides. That ceasefire and the truce between the sides was supposed to include the Lebanese military deploying in the southern parts of Lebanon, disarming and dismantling Hezbollah infrastructure, the Israeli military withdrawing back to the border, and the Lebanese military taking over. With that, the Israeli military did not withdraw because it said that the Lebanese military did not deploy fast enough. And over the past week, the Lebanese government made public and said it does not have the capability to disarm Hezbollah by force. Now, many analysts, I would say myself included, would argue the Lebanese military does have the capability. Hezbollah is right now very weakened, and it does have the capability to disarm them by force. However, that does also run the risk of civil war. Hezbollah is still very strong, and even though I would argue the Lebanese military would probably come out on top, it does run the risk of civil war. And Hezbollah went as far as to very heavily threaten that. Did not openly say they would go to civil war, said, if you try to disarm us, it will lead to bad situations between the sides like we had in the past being Lebanese civil war. That is, I would say, largely the reason the Lebanese government is sort of the one that blinked first in that game of chicken. It's not because they can't, it's because they don't want to risk civil war at this time. With that, there have been increasing escalations of the Israeli attacks in southern Lebanon, and these have come as Hezbollah is also throwing its weight much more into rearming itself and redeveloping its military presence in the southern parts of Lebanon. 2 weeks ago, Israel carried out a major assassination in Beirut, killing Haytham Abatabai, who was the chief of staff of the Hezbollah military. Hezbollah has yet to retaliate, so we don't know exactly what's going to happen there, but the situation is just continuing to escalate. What happened this past week is that on Monday, the Saudi Al-Hadath reported that the United States sent messages, bear with me, sent messages to the Iraqi government, the government in Iraq, saying Israel plans to launch a major campaign to disarm Hezbollah by force in Lebanon. And this is a warning to the militias in Iraq, where there are a lot of pro-Iranian militias, not to retaliate. That Israel asked the United States to inform Iraq that if the militias in Iraq retaliate, Israel will carry out bombing campaigns in Iraq itself. Very roundabout, I know, but again, another indication that things are coming up. It's also a threat, because Israel would not publicly ask the United States to do that if they didn't want that message, obviously, to get to Hezbollah in Lebanon. There were also reports that were put out in Lebanon. The Pope visited Lebanon this week. There were a lot of reports that Israel's planning a campaign for after the Pope leaves. They didn't want to do so when all the world media attention was on that visit. It hasn't happened yet. The United States is scrambling to try to stop this major escalation. It actually arranged a meeting this week, the first of its kind, between Lebanese government officials and Israeli government officials that met in Anakora, an area right on the border, to discuss theoretically economic and civilian matters, but I would say pretty obviously they discussed military matters as well. That said, once again, I'm just going to repeat, the attacks that the Israeli military is carrying out in southern Lebanon are increasing daily. There were massive bombings on Thursday of different villages in southern Lebanon. Israel said it was targeting warehouses of Hezbollah. It issued evacuation orders to Lebanese villages. Hezbollah is also increasing its rhetoric constantly and saying we're getting closer to the point of no return when there's going to be another escalation between the sides. I will say, kind of like the situation in Gaza, this will depend on Trump. Right now, the entire situation depends on Trump. If Trump tells Israel, no, you don't, at this point, Israel will not. Hezbollah, in turn, is not as controlled by Lebanon. It's much more controlled by Iran. But Hezbollah has a vested interest in not escalating right now because they're still licking their wounds from the war and they're still rebuilding. So seemingly, there's a powder keg there that is constantly, the fuse is getting shorter and shorter. has not fully exploded yet, but I am putting out there it might be exploding in the coming weeks. So again, it's just another arena that I think people should be paying attention to. With that, I am looking at a few more questions. People are mentioning the West Bank. Absolutely, the West Bank is another arena that needs to be discussed. I do not want to discuss it this week, but I promise you I will dedicate time in my summaries either throughout the week or next week to that arena. Again, if you have not done so, hit that subscribe button because I will upload summaries all the time, looking at what's happening here, and the West Bank will appear there, I promise. I'm looking at some of the other question. Question: If the Lebanese government doesn't have the will to take the country, they don't have the will to keep it. Is Israel expected to keep it for them forever? I mean, it's an interesting question, but broadly speaking, if a government does not have control over its territory, that does not grant license to another government to take over that territory by international law. What will happen in terms of fighting Hezbollah? Again, I'll say at this point that kind of remains to be seen. Other question: is the massive new American embassy complex in Lebanon fully staffed up now? To my knowledge, yes. The United States did a very big ceremony about opening the embassy there. But again, remains to be seen and maybe cleared out if there is very quickly an escalation. With that, I'm going to thank everyone for joining. Thank you for the questions. Again, if you have not done so already, please send these reports to anyone you think might be interested. I set a personal goal for myself of reaching 10,000 subscribers by the end of 2025. So hit that subscribe button. Please send these on to anyone you think might be interested. In case anyone has forgotten, I'm Alon Burstein. I'm a professor of political science and Israel Institute fellow at Tufts University. I will stay on for another few minutes if anyone has any more questions, but thanks for watching. Thank you, everyone.